community actual lives. So like, what is the infrastructure and what are the priorities of making the transportation system more sustainable? And how are they prioritizing that for particular areas? They would want to have in the MLK strip wasn't really listening to the community, so they skip a really like key one. So I guess I'm thinking to stop at MLK, which is Graham and MLK, like manifest a lot. It's either like the Columbia City, Alaska one, or and I lived in between, so I'm like, well, I have to walk like a significant distance either way. So it's like either you're a community.
You can't get medical equipment from Walgreens, and they have insurance for medication. Funding businesses that are contributing to this.
What was it? I think there's only one male classroom teacher, and then the phys ed teacher is male. So I think
security issues and same hostage issues that they do in other places. So I think education.
Whatever they're doing right, but also outreach from the city to have that available resource for them to express their concern. I mean, you know, I'm hearing a lot of different things about it, right?
that's a good framework.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just want to pitch my 2 cents.
Touching on kind of what I think you're saying, you're talking about certain communities that want better
First of all, give it up for yourselves again for doing all that hard work. Shake your neighbor's hand. Love your neighbor. All right, what we're going to be doing now is sharing some of the amazing ideas that we brought up together as a group. So what I'm going to ask each group to do is to come up. You can bring 1 or 2 people and just very briefly give us about 2 or 3 of the highlighted ideas that you'd like to share for us regarding the certain topics that you were discussing. So I'm going to actually invite the safety group first. Sure. You guys be down? And please say your name, what part of the city you're from, and just so we can get a little introduction to each other. And again, thanks for showing up, everybody.
My name is Miguel. I'm from Othello, or I live in Othello, not from Othello. So our group discussed issues of safety today. Like many of the topics, I think one of the things that we grappled with a little bit was the intersectional nature of safety and how it's just tied in with a lot of the other topics here, particularly housing and education. But we tried to stick to the prompt. So a couple of the things we came up with very important to us was the issues of hate crime and how that has been endorsed by our current administration, and how we would like to be counter to that as a city, and how we don't feel like we are right now. And I think one of the ways that we could change that would simply be by the rhetoric of our leaders, particularly our mayoral candidate. So other issues we have on here, sorry. We talked a lot about the people in our community who are housing insecure and the safety risks that are that they deal with on a regular basis, particularly with the camp sweeps, how those are being run right now. I don't know who saw the sweep on Rainier Avenue last week, but it was quite aggressive and just something that we don't want to see our city doing in that way. And we also talked about the issue that it poses to the community having such a large population of people who are housing insecure. There's a multitude of safety issues around that. We talked a lot about police accountability. I don't know if that's a new idea for anyone here. But yeah, I'm sorry, what was the name of that committee, the commission? The CPC. And how that was an utter failure for the city, and just kind of some ways that we might be able to readdress that. It seemed like a good idea in the beginning. Didn't work. We talked about safety a lot in our daily commutes. We had people represented who are drivers, people who use public transportation, people who are cyclists as well, and each of the various ways that we deal with issues of safety in that. The road diet in Rainier Avenue is an example of that, but as well, how are we feeling safe while we're on public transportation? Are we addressing issues of safety that we see other people experiencing, and this one's kind of tied in with that first point there. And how are we feeling safe at night using this public transportation or walking around our city? And there are some hot spots for that. The last point on there was the nightlife. Capitol Hill is kind of a hotbed of unsafe situations, particularly on the weekends and evenings. And then finally, we talked a lot about the prison industrial complex. How is our city participating in that and endorsing that, particularly in the way that specifically was brought up, the fact that our city purchases all of its furniture from prison labor. So yeah, didn't know that, did you? So yeah, I'm not sure if there's other things I should address, but that seems like the meat of our discussion. Thank you.
I just have a couple more things that we missed on here that I wanted to mention as well, and that was it's like bridging, somehow figuring out a way to bridge gap between the two examples I used was abolitionists and NIMBYs. How do we get, it's like we have to educate people who like aren't with our cause without giving too much to them, because of course when we bring this, we might show a NIMBY, say here, this is what's happening to the houseless crisis, and they'll actually see the brutalization that's going on to the houseless people in our city. But then their answer will always be, well, let's just send more police out there, let's just do this, which is not our solutions. And of course, the abolition issue, I mean, not issue, but like we can also bring that to said communities, you know what I'm saying? Because like, and Jamil, while he was over there, also made a point of saying that, if we took half of the police and made them community members and organizers, we wouldn't need the other half of the police. So I just think it's really important that we go for our goals without having to give in too much or anything of our values. So yeah, that's why I have
You're live, everybody. Say hi. Hi. Hey, all right, next we're going to have education.
Okay, so we discussed education K through university with mostly an emphasis on pre-K through 12. And also education outside of university. Is this not on or?
No, you should speak louder, please.
I need to speak louder?
Yes.
Okay. And also we talked a little bit about education outside of public and private school environments and the role that that plays in communities. And so we talked about the importance of anti-racist training for teachers, particularly in terms of going through their training to become teachers, not something that happens after they're already teachers. So a necessity going through to become a teacher, because there are so many teachers who reach the point where they are qualified to teach and actually are not qualified to teach. They are book smart, but they are not community smart. Okay. And then also we discussed changing the curriculum, or at least amending it, and kind of, I guess, looking at what the curriculum is supposed to do as of right now, what it does, and kind of the goals that it's trying to reach versus what it should be doing. And as of right now, Seattle Public School curriculum is not teaching students to understand their role in society and also understand their necessity and their importance. It's very much about mathematics, sciences, which is important, but it's not about facilitating individuals and also communities for, for greatness and for contribution. And so we talked about that. And then also talked about the necessity of representation of various people in staff, faculty, leadership, teacher positions in public schools in particular. The fact that many of our students of color in public schools do not get to see representations of themselves in the classroom, and the representations that they do see of themselves are teachers who are literally having to choose between their mental health and their students, and trying to kind of make sense of all of that. So why do we put our students of color and our teachers of color in positions where they are having to choose between their mental health and their education? That is criminal. And then also talking about youth, parent, and community voice, and the role that parents can play, and also the way that schools often ice out parents, the way the school boards often ice out parents, the fact that parents with a certain income, with a certain ethnic, socioeconomic background often feel very uncomfortable, rightly so, speaking at school boards and meetings and trying to be involved in their kids' education. The fact that many lower income, particularly parents of color, feel very intimidated in the presence of people who have, these degrees on degrees on degrees, but are not doing anything for their kids. And so how do you navigate a system where degrees of people are mattering more than your own children's education? That's messed up. And then also talked about equitable access to quality buildings, materials, food, curriculum, programs, and not just accessible, but something that is provided and acknowledged for students. Oftentimes students go through their public school education or are living in the community and don't know that there are services there for them until a certain point when they are in the danger zone and are on kind of the precipice of mass incarceration or have already gone through that. And so we talked about kind of making sure that students in public schools know that there are services, and also making sure that there are new services for those students that have the purpose of making sure that students are served, mind, body, soul, and education, and academics as well. And so someone at the end of our meeting mentioned food and the fact that so many kids in public schools have really terrible diets, are literally eating really gross stuff, and it's supposed to be feeding their minds. And when you look at the setup of how kids are learning in public schools, from the curriculum they have, again, we were talking about curriculum, to what they're putting in their bodies, to the choices that they're being forced to make in terms of their mental health. We're not, as a city, setting up particularly kids of color for success. We're setting them up and complicit in incarceration because we are not giving them very necessary and very easy stuff to give them. So we really talked about that, and then also to finish up, inclusive discipline framework and anti-bullying, particularly with an emphasis on race, gender, and learning differences as well. And so for kids who learn differently, I'm someone who has a learning difference, and it's often very challenging maneuvering, interacting with my peers and interacting with teachers, particularly as a Black female, with kind of the fear of being stereotyped and further pushed down. So how can teachers and faculty members facilitate in making sure that kids with learning differences are very much a part of the community, not sitting out in the hallways, not sitting there, feeling isolated, and also make them feel as though they are a necessity to the world. So that was pretty much. Do you have anything else?
Well, I feel like another piece of that is, with all of these things, how do we ensure that they're equitable across the district? Right. Not just in one area and not in the other. Like, how do we make that more accessible to everybody?
Yeah.
All right, next up we have housing.
This one's Sabrina.
Hi, James and Sabrina, and we talked about housing, and so we had some recurring themes that came up in our discussions again and again and again. These themes were the fact that rent is too high, segregation intertwined with gentrification, homeless sweeps, and community displacement. And not only these, but how they create architectural trauma, people coming back to their neighborhoods and not being able to recognize them, as well as just complete physical environment erasure, no longer being the neighborhood that it was. We're going to, I guess, just stick with the question prompts. What Seattle does do well, we said that there's a good effort to conserve parks, which we appreciate. Public art, like the art that you see in this building and in certain areas around the city, and availability of transit. And that was where that part of the discussion stopped. And then the larger part of the discussion.
We worked hard to come up with those.
So what Seattle does not do well, obviously we have the housing affordability, which is a cause, and the homeless issue, which is a symptom of this cause. Going along with that, as people are well aware, the tent sweeps, shutdown of the jungle, which leads to recurring sweeps and sweeps and sweeps, and just you can never get the dust out, so you keep sweeping it, I guess. And so we talked about a policy that was dependent, unfortunately, on the market rather than affordability for the people that live there. And the fact that public housing seems to be a taboo topic rather than private development of housing. We continued talking about the negativity of the HALA policy with new construction and how there's unfortunately a bubble that can appear in that sort of housing creation if you just keep pushing the funds aside for new housing, new housing, new housing, and then the bubble bursts, then there's no more, the funds are there for housing that's not getting built. And so we looked at it in a really a long-term situation of, you know, how are we going to continue this so that we don't keep falling back into these same cycles. And also, really just company corporate responsibility. These companies are coming here, they're benefiting from the city, they need to pay their fair share. That was what came up over and over again. And then what we would like, so what Seattle should do, making more community spaces. Dual zoning came up, which seemed to be a topic that a lot of people were interested in. Heavy restrictions for developers, and even the idea of no more new developers, creating a cap for developers, as well as prioritizing Africatown and community-based initiatives, rather than private developers or government developers, letting communities decide what they want to put in there. And the private developers that do come, putting money to it in a pot that's based on real affordability, not the $80,000 medium income that your average teacher doesn't have. And so we came up with some questions, and I'll hold this up, Sabrina. You want to talk about it? Sabrina has a specific example she wanted to do.
How are we going to make booming industries accountable for paying for more affordable housing? How do we avoid homelessness sweeps? How do we stop that as a city and make that something that is morally wrong? And how do we regulate foreign investors or developers in our city? Because as we've seen in Vancouver, they create these ghost towns of unaffordable housing. And so how do we, now that Vancouver has enacted a tax, more of those investors are coming to Seattle. So what do we do to start making housing affordable and to keep ourselves out of that bubble of these ghost towns where, you know, millionaires buy 3 or 4 condos? So I think one of the things that we really wanted to talk about is public housing and how we need to reclaim that as a good and a right. And that instead of shying away from the idea of taxing people who can afford, those of us who make more, give more. And those who don't have the financial ability to give, we give in other ways, but we come together as a community. So not mixed, but just as an organic community. So.
All right, I think we got the healthcare group next.
I'm Jess, and we're talking about healthcare. So in our group, we had quite a few healthcare professionals actually who had a lot of knowledge to share. We also had folks who just have their own experience to talk about with the healthcare system. And then we also had folks bring up like who's not at the table and why aren't they at the table, thinking about their concerns and how we can also address their concerns. So we brought up questions of access, so in terms of outreach, education about healthcare rights that we all have or we don't have. How can we make sure that that is something that's communicated to the community and the people who need to hear about those rights. Particularly refugee community, undocumented folks, uninsured folks, and also practicing cultural sensitivity and making sure that we have people, specialists who can work with the LGBTQ community too. We thought that services in schools, so providing like food and, but also healthcare services for children in schools was really good. And I think we had people who thought that this was already good. I mean, of course, there's always things that we can improve on, but yeah. Insurance and the fact that Medicaid and Medicare is not accepted widely. Jess had an example earlier where they had an optometrist tell them that there was only one optometrist who accepts Medicaid in the entirety of Seattle. Yikes.
I haven't verified that.
Possibly. And then we talked about the different types of practices that we can access. So there's a prioritization of Western practices, but what about alternative practices and moving towards an integrated approach, bridging the gap to alternative services like doulas and acupuncture and all that good stuff. And then we also spoke about how Seattle is a hub of research for a lot of different things, like Fred Hutch, you know, and then making sure that this research is something that will also benefit the communities living in Seattle, and not just like, you know, certain parts of Seattle, but like all of Seattle, right? And then we also spoke on the concerns of, you know, maybe the federal funding, maybe taking away from particular services, and so we were thinking about what's going to be lost. We spoke on Meals on Wheels, and like free and reduced lunch in schools. Someone brought up that there are services that need to be improved at the moment, but then also how are we splitting the funding so that we are also improving the services that we have currently, but also making sure that the communities that are being reached by the services that they do have access to right now, and they are benefiting from, how can we continue funding those as well? So a both ends approach.
Covered everything.
Cool.
All right, finally we have transportation.
What's good, y'all? Good.
I'm Flo.
We're talking about transportation. We didn't write down on the paper, that might have been helpful, but we talked a lot about accessibility and the light rail, and when we talk about where the light rail is getting put in, how that kind of contributes to gentrification and a new influx of people, and we talked about
we talked a lot about also the intersections of safety as well as transportation, thinking about the infrastructure of light rail where do these stops get placed, and what is safeguarded and what is not. So we did a comparison between the MLK strip, where it's kind of open in air, versus the development of other light rail stops, which is underground and is, doesn't affect the community in safety precaution in that manner. We also talked about protecting transportation choices. What does that look like? What is available in specific neighborhoods, bike lanes versus none, or where do dollars end up going to being proactive versus being responsive in transportation? So I guess I forgot what those things are called, but those barriers in the middle to make sure that there's not like random U-turns to potentially hit kids or elderly people. One of the members of the round table, Pedro, was also bouncing between healthcare and ours, but really posed a lot of great questions around who the neighborhood is representing, how does the city, but also the transportation companies, the LaSalle Transit versus Metro, how are they doing community outreach? Are they getting language accessible resources in terms of flyers and hosting sessions, really responding to what is the priority of the people that are there.
And when they're not, when they are doing outreach and it's all in English, and you try to hold them accountable, they always try to pass the buck off, like, no, that wasn't us, that was Metro, or that was Sound Transit, and not the city. So there's no accountability there. And then we also talked about accessibility and fare enforcement, and how absurd it is to kind of have this transportation that makes you interact with the police, and that money that is spent on fare enforcement could actually go to making fare cheaper. So we wouldn't actually need fare enforcement.
Yeah, I think the last part is, again, about resource prioritization. What is allocated more, whether that's towards more car infrastructure projects versus public transportation projects. So I think a suggestion of one of our team was to have more bus-only lanes, to really, again, prioritizing the choices of more accessibility and not get caught up in the terrible traffic of I-5 kind of stuff. Yeah, that's it.
I want to thank you all for including yourselves in the process. And mind you, I'm going live while trying to fix the mic. Well, this is new. So give it up. First of all, say hi to everybody. Hi, everybody. That's awesome. All right, we're going to be introducing first, and again, I want to thank everybody for participating and including your thoughts. We're going to be bringing Nikkita up next to conclude our program for today with some closing thoughts. And please stick around. We'd love to just build with you. And also for community who are living in the building, we are having a potluck for the building residents after this, so stick around. All right, thank you so much.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming out and sharing your collective brilliance with us. We're learning a lot just being in community, not just about what the needs are, but really what the breadth of solutions are. And so really honored that you would spend time on a Sunday afternoon with us. I don't want to make a lot of comments. I would actually rather take questions. And I hope that y'all will allow me the flexibility to also be able to say, I don't know yet, but we will, and we are working on that. Because we're sitting in a very different position than the incumbent is sitting in. We don't have a $300,000 campaign budget and a 5.6 or I think it's $6.6 million office currently working on our behalf. What we have is all of you and an incredible volunteer campaign committee that is made up of grassroots organizers, educators, who are wanting to serve our community in this way. And so we're down to grind, but I also want to invite you all, any of you who have expertise in an area that would like to participate in developing the platform, like, we invite you in. We want you in. because what we've realized through doing these listening posts is there's a wealth of knowledge that is almost always excluded from the decision-making table, and that is not only something that we're uncomfortable with, but it's something we're unwilling to accept. So if you have a particular area of expertise and you would like to lend that to the People's Party as we develop this platform, let one of the folks who you've seen around here know, or fill out the volunteer form online. And with that being said, do you have thoughts, questions? I'll say one more thing. What we have, what's very clear is we need an intersectional approach to policymaking. That decisions we make around housing will ultimately have an impact on transportation, and transportation will have an impact on housing and healthcare and education. How many of y'all lived in the South End when the light rail was built? I did. And what I saw was the South End was a precursor to gentrification. And people were saying that. People were saying this is going to push people out. This is going to push people out. City, what are you going to do to make sure people are not pushed out? And here we are, and people are rapidly being pushed out. And so it's really important, I think, that we're intersectional in our response to things, that we start thinking about how do we create sustainable revenue models that allow us to do exactly what housing was talking about, not being reliant upon vouchers or a private market that actually doesn't have that much housing in it that's available. And getting back to the idea that a city that cares about the health of the people in it will have public housing accessible, and not just any type of public housing. We're talking about public housing that is not just up to standard or up to code, but that people want to live in, that allow people to live healthy lives. And so in order to get there, we need to start thinking about more sustainable revenue models, but also where do we spend our money? We have a $5.6 billion budget for our city, and I don't think most people realize we spend over half of that budget on so-called criminal justice, on courts, on police, on jails. And oftentimes what we're prosecuting in Seattle Municipal Court are quality of life crimes. So we're prosecuting people for being poor, when really what we should be doing is finding ways to elevate what people have access to, and then we wouldn't need to prosecute so many folks, and we can put money in the right places. So I think there's a lot of changes that need to be made. And so with that said, what are some of y'all's thoughts and questions? None. Yeah.
So, I guess my main question is not going to be easy one just to answer. How could a space or a campaign be accountable, or how would you try to make it accountable in a space where, like, I mean, it was pretty clear, I don't know how people are, but when most of the people that are supporting it or live in Seattle are not from Seattle, how are we making it accountable to people that are actually from Seattle and no longer can even live here already? Because a lot of those decisions directly affect them, though they don't have any voice anymore within the city because they can't afford the city.
So are you saying that the folks that are working on the campaign today don't live in Seattle?
Well, I'm saying, like, a lot of people that grew up in Seattle, a lot of people that, I'm not saying nobody on the campaign, I'm saying a lot of the campaign people are not from Seattle. They didn't grow up here, and a lot of people that have grown up here and have history here are no longer in Seattle and have no voice within Seattle. And how is that able to be?
Well, this is part of that process. These listening posts are part of that process, and I don't think there's a perfect answer to that. I didn't grow up here. I moved to Seattle in 2004 to go to college, and didn't leave after spending lots of years living in the South End and working in community. I think an actual large amount of the folks on our team do currently live in Seattle. I think part of the listening post is to invite folks in who want to be a part of it. And there are people here who are from surrounding cities who have been pushed out. Raise your hand if you live in a surrounding city. So there are people who have been pushed out that are coming to these meetings, and we're not telling anyone who doesn't live in Seattle not to come. In fact, we're inviting you to help us acknowledge that Seattle as a city has a massive impact on Tukwila, on Renton, on Kent, and in fact, that's where people are being pushed. Part of the reason we're running this campaign, and I'll openly say, like, this is not my first choice in life direction. I love young people. I want to be an educator. That's what I've spent most of my life doing. But realizing that if people don't start getting in places to mitigate harm, then we're gonna all be pushed south or pushed out. And so either we step up and we do it, folks like me take on honestly, the trauma, because there are a lot of conversations I've had over the past 2 weeks that don't feel good. And lines that I've had to hold that don't feel good, or we will all be pushed out. So part of developing our platform in an organic manner, so you'll see things go up on the website, and if we start getting a lot of messages from people who say like, that's actually not gonna serve us, and here's all the reasons that's wrong with it, we'll change it. We'll be organic about it. But I think reality is, Seattle's gone so far down this hole that we got to the point where it's like, if we don't do something now, we will all be pushed out. Those of us who are new here, who don't have the level of income to stay here, and then those folks who are here, who have been here for forever, who don't have the level of income to stay here. I will say that as a party, we believe in the right to stay. So if Seattle's not investing in the rights of people who have been here for the long haul to stay in the space they want to be in, then what Seattle is saying is not that it values equity, but that it values displacing people, taking our cultural capital, and then allowing other people to capitalize upon it, to exploit it as a means of capitalization and production. And that's not a value for us. So we want to create the right to stay, but then, and in creating something like public housing and addressing what does affordability really mean, create space for people who want to come back. This is your home and it's where you want to live. And I think the only way we're gonna do that is by some folks stepping up and saying, you know what, I will go into that place that doesn't feel good and actually doesn't serve us well, and draw hard lines in the sand. So I don't know if that's not a perfect answer, because it sucks, and I am a transplant. I've lived here for 13.5 years. But it's the answer I have, because I do value people's right to stay in the place that they call home. Please, I'm not any, I think one thing that makes me most uncomfortable about this thing is I don't want to be anything other than a public servant. I don't want to be honored. I don't want to go to meetings and have people say like, you're such and such. Like, I really want to be accountable and transparent and a part of y'all. So I appreciate you and your love.
Nikkita, what are the sustainable revenue models you're thinking of, and how do you anticipate implementing some of your priorities or platform, particularly when you're going to get pushback from within and beyond?
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll start first with our existing budget. We have a $5.6 billion budget with a $1.2 billion general fund. And there are a lot of places where we actually waste money. Part of that is pointing to how we organize our so-called criminal justice system. I think is part of it. If we're spending 60% of our city budget on that, and it's prosecuting quality of life crimes, and it's actually using up a substantial amount of resources that we could be using to address community needs, I think we need to think about what our values are. So that's one place. The next is, we use a very regressive tax model, and I actually think of it's reactionary. So while the levy that's being proposed for the ballot is really important in terms of getting an emergency fund to address the emergency need of homelessness, grandma who's barely making her house payments now, and or maybe she's owned her home for 30 years, and property taxes are already so high she can barely afford it, one more property tax might just be the thing that pushes her out of her home. It does exactly what you were pointing to, pushes her out of Seattle, right? And so how do we grapple with the fact that the sort of tax structure we use isn't a sustainable model? And it's actually not equitable. Part of the reason it exists is because in the 1930s they decided that income was a form of property. There's a court case. And so the state says we tax everybody's property at I think it's a 1% rate, and that's supposed to be equitable. But if we look at history, we know that people historically have not had access to the same wealth development. So if that's the case, then you have folks who have always had access to a lot of property, and so taxing across the board at the same level actually is not equitable. So I think we have to move towards a progressive tax scheme, and one that includes income. There is a group of folks organizing to tax, I think it's 1.5%, folks who make over $250K a year, as a way of creating a new, more sustainable revenue model. And it's not actually favorable in our state, it's not favorable in our city, and the likelihood of that happening would actually probably take about 4 years. Because there'd likely be a series of litigation that would occur to get the law changed from the 1930s, like this idea about income as property started in the 1930s. We'd have to go through some litigation. And the city would have to say, we believe that this is such an important change that we will commit city resources to following this litigation through to the point that we can actually start to tax income at that level. Until we get to that point, I think things like levies are going to continue to be a reality. I would rather first figure out how do we restructure our budget to move funds around to meet needs. And it is possible. $5.6 billion is actually a lot of money, and spending 60% of our budget on so-called criminal justice is a lot of money, and there are ways to restructure. There's other ways, but those would be like some of the key ones right now. Yes?
I got your opinion about tent cities that are popping up in the city of Seattle. And the question for me is, we went through all this money to try to make it better, but the young lady or young man who has kids who lose their job, all of a sudden they're on the street. So this is the working poor.
Yeah.
And we keep on throwing good money trying to fix a problem that we haven't demonstrated yet that we know what's going on. What's your opinion, and how are you planning to correct this? We got working families, or really the working poor, who's just one check or one medical issue away from being on the street. But we were willing to throw money. I saw a tweet yesterday of the highway under the bridge. There were so many machinery, so many trucks, so many people cleaning up the trash. That's thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars for a parent who has 2 or 3 kids, knowing that they miss one rent payment.
Yeah.
They're on the street.
Yeah.
So it's a vicious cycle. So what are you gonna do about this?
First of all, I think sweeps are an incredible waste of money. They cost about $1 million plus each. If for every sweep that we had, that money was actually poured into housing or helping that parent pay rent when they couldn't make it happen, we'd have less people on the street. Reality is, in the encampments, there are lots of unsheltered children. And I think what bothers me most is that people do not realize what it's like to live outside and to only have that choice. And so we have to first get to the point where we, instead of having problems with the encampments, our problem is with people being unsheltered. And that's the real issue. So I think housing first is really important. And there is money in the city to start building housing. That's just not where we're choosing to invest our funds. So an example would be the Burke-Gilman Trail is being completed for $31 million. And what folks have told me at the city is, well, that's a different bucket of money, you know, we have to spend it on this thing. Well, rules are meant to be changed, and if we say we have a state of emergency around houselessness and homelessness, then let's change the rule and move the money and build the housing. I also think what you're saying about the working poor and living just a check away from being out of your home, people don't realize how common that is within our city. And instead of caring about the parents who are grinding day in and day out just to live here, a city where the average rent is like, for 1 bedroom is like $1,400 a month. I can't afford that. I have hella roommates to survive, right? I just got pushed out of the Central District because my rent got raised $400. So, and I only had 60 days to move, right? I'm moving one person. A parent who's moving a whole household of people, I just don't know where they go. And so we have to start figuring that out. That's why people are ending up in encampments. housing first. I think the navigation center is a great idea in terms of having people know there's a place to go find resources. You don't get to just plop that down in any neighborhood, but they think they can do that to Little Saigon and they don't have to have a conversation first. So I think there are complexities that we have to address, but reality is there's money in the city and we have to be willing to move it. If we really believe that we're in a state of emergency around homelessness, which we are, instead of sweeping people around and disturbing the little bit of a foundation that people build for themselves, I mean, that's really resilience. To go find a place, put up a tent, and build yourself enough of a community that you can at least survive is a form of resilience that I think most people are not willing to acknowledge. And so every time a person gets swept, we increase the amount of trauma they're surviving through and increase the likelihood that they won't be able to keep their job. Because a lot of people who live in encampments are actually working. We make it so they'll lose their jobs because now they just lost their housing, the little bit of housing they had. I think we have to grapple with what that means. And there's money, period. $5.6 billion, there's money.
Can I respond to the gentleman's question?
Yeah, I would love you to.
Regarding the working poor, I actually work at the United Indians of All Tribes Foundation. We're funded by a new program called Best Starts for Kids. It's from King County, and our funding comes from the Youth and Family Homelessness Prevention Initiative, and it is established to support working families who are one bill away from hardship that would lead to eviction. So this money, it comes from a tax levy, so it's guaranteed, I think, for like 6 years, but the program itself is like on a 3-year track. This is the first year that it's been implemented. So right now there are 27 agencies in King County who have received this, the funding, this is grant awards. And there are nonprofit agencies. They're like the United Indians of All Tribes Foundation, Africa Town, I think, Native Women in Need, or some others, LifeWire, Partners in Employment, Auburn Youth Resources, I think it's called Nexus. Now there's several throughout the county that are addressing this issue of supporting working poor who may be one bill, medical bill, one car repairs bill, things like that, away from a hardship that would create an eviction. So there's information on it. If you guys would like to find out more information, you can Google Best Starts for Kids, King County, or you can go kcprevention.com, or I'm sorry, kcprevention.weebly.com. Also, if you want to just come ask me about it, I'll try to give you more information and more links about it. But that is one thing that the county is addressing, the fact that there are working poor people who are just one step away from entering or having a hardship that would create an eviction and people becoming homeless. So that is one thing that the county is doing.
And I'd also say the city and the county seem to have a fairly contentious relationship with each other. And so I think finding ways to better align our structures and our efforts to address community needs with each other could help us better serve families. And then we wouldn't be going at odds with one another. And that's a complicated relationship, right? Because there's a level at which we want the city to still be able to advocate for its own needs under the county, but also acknowledging we could better help each other and better support the multifaceted efforts and opportunities we have. And I think it has to be intersectional. And I think there's a traditional group of accepted people who get brought to the table, and then there's folks who don't. So I think also part of solving our problem is inviting in those families. But lastly, why are we accepting the idea that working poor is okay? It's not okay that families live one medical bill away from being kicked out of their homes. Like, you actually shouldn't have to worry about medical bills. You should have access to health care. And those are things that would take time to develop, and we'd have to create sustainable models for, but those actually exist in the world, so it's not like we'd be recreating the wheel. We just have to be willing to change structures that we've become used to, and I think many cities have gotten used to having a working poor and have accepted that as just a part of the norm, and it just simply doesn't have to be. So, I think we could take one more question. Yeah.
here?
Yeah.
So this might be a leading question, but we've been talking a lot about how rent's affecting individuals, which is, I think, first and foremost, one of the most important things. Rent is also, both rent and development is impacting businesses. Businesses aren't able to afford their rent and closing. Businesses aren't able to withstand construction. Have you been outreaching yet with those local business owners, even the corporate ones, to kind of rein in their solutions as well?
Great question. So we had a meeting last week to start talking about, in particular, the impact this is having in places like the International District. And what would it look like for the city to invest in community development in a way that local businesses can stay where they are. And I think the right to stay isn't just about individual renters or homeowners, it is also about local businesses, because that's part of what gives our city the character that it has. And the International District is being deeply impacted, not just by gentrification, but also transportation and changes that are going to come as a convention center is redone. And so you're absolutely right, we have to get in better relationship with those local businesses to understand what strategies would serve them. One that was brought up was actually getting the city to invest in community development and learning from that mess that happened on 23rd, right? Where they were doing that street construction for like, I don't know, 2 years. And businesses ended up having to get the NAACP to advocate for them and say, this is killing our business. The city has to start thinking intersectionally about, great, let's make streets safer and better, but if we're gonna do that, we have to invest money in businesses so they can stay open. Putting up signs is not enough. And for a small business that is in basically the same position as a family, might be one paycheck away, one low month away from losing their business, it's the same idea. So I think some community development strategies developed in relationship with local communities is going to be essential. And I think when it comes to corporations, we just have to be willing to ask corporations to invest more. They want to be here, and they're not going to stop being here. The tech industry is not going to stop tomorrow because we've asked Amazon to invest more in the community that they seem to want to be in. In fact, I think that will make them want to stay longer, because now they've actually had to invest capital in the space. So I think we have to stop being afraid of corporations and start caring more about the people in the space that's here. We are working on building those relationships. I think for us, though, wanting to start here has really been essential, because what we've seen with politics is corporations already have access to politicals. If we get the office, and we're in the position to make the power decisions, they're gonna have to access this anyways. So, but what politicals have not had to do is access the people. So I think that's great, and we're definitely gonna be working in particular on having deep conversations with the folks in the International District and the API community, because there's some real concerns there around what gentrification and corporatizing development is doing in those spaces. Thank you. I'm going to let Jamil close us out.
Yeah.
And again, thank you all for joining us. This is just one listening session, and we hope to be really engaged in the community throughout the spring and summer. And I'll again, thank you guys. One last thing I would like to mention is that we have the wonderful Ayan here. And if you are interested in donating to us, we are accepting donations. Just to let folks know, we're all volunteer, all grassroots. Nobody's getting paid, not yet. What we would like to do is start building a foundation so we can really start getting our message across and your message across. So visit Ayan, she's in the back. Get some food and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thank you so much. Hold on one moment. Skirt, Nikki.
Hold that thought. There are been myself as well as some other folks with cameras. Most of the stuff, footage that we have that's coming from me is going to be for future stuff that we're doing. Also collective information as far as like what people have been saying, so that we can make sure that we get the platform right. But if you do not want your face somewhere, please let us know. I will take a picture and make sure that that is a blurred face, just so you know. So just let me know. Thank you.
Let me know also, please.
So
Oh, yes, and of course. Next Sunday, we want to invite everybody here, as well as all your families and friends, to Washington Hall at 3 p.m. You can come a little bit early if you'd like to help out. And we will have our official launch and Kickstarter fundraiser for Nikkita Oliver for mayor. So.
Two things. One, if you have not been over to Red Lounge or the Taste of Caribbean, we will be doing a special segment at Ringside with Nikkita. Doors open at 7:30. That's this Friday.
Black-owned local business.
Black-owned local business, taking care of the CD, trying to spread love into that, as well as we would like to take a group picture. If you so need to be blurred, I would say stand to the side. If you don't mind being in that Kodak, we would love to take a picture of everybody. Where do we want to do that? You just all stay put, because y'all look so good, and we'll just get up on a platform and take a picture downward. Great. Just snug it, just snug together. Snug together. However, I don't know where Nikkita is, but she in the don't worry about her. She'll be okay. She'll be okay.
So that's it for today, folks, with the meeting with Nikkita Oliver. There will be a couple more coming up, so make sure you pay attention to the page and also pay attention to Independent Two-Spirit Media page. So make sure that you keep up with everything that's going on and put every effort that you can into coming and seeing these events because they're very worth it. Thank you very much and have a blessed day.